This is an important gathering. I mean, if you don't have an agenda, we've got some spare ones around as far as what we're going to do today. But this is a gathering of folks whose opinion I value and that I have encountered in the course of my 30 years doing Texas history stuff. These are people that I've encountered in various situations. Some of them are academics, as you would imagine. Some of them actually are in professions where they expect results. And so that's important as well. And so I wanted to hear voices from all over the state and from all sorts of scenarios where Texas is being discussed. And so that was the thinking behind who I wanted to put here. Now, the purpose of our gathering is to inaugurate an advisory board for the Texas Center, which is a very bold move on the part of a small D3 school in the Hill Country to begin having an impact, a relevancy in the big conversations going on around the state. You know, it's pretty easy in higher education just to think about selling hours. You know, students coming in, students going out, and that's what you do as your educational function. But the people at Schreiner understand that universities have an additional function, and that is to be cultural leaders. And they said, we're going to be uniquely Texan. Well, there's not a whole lot of schools in the state of Texas that are making such a bold claim. There's a lot of schools in Texas that just assume that it's part of the organic atmosphere of their campus. But I can tell you that it is not. By and large, the professoriates at these universities may not even be from Texas. Oftentimes they feel like they're on a missionary journey in and amongst the savages. And so what is really refreshing for me about Schreiner is that they have run boldly into this story. Now then, I'll tell you an old story about Red Adair. You know, one of the times he was asked, why does he fight those well fires? And he says, well, let me explain it to you. One time there was a big well fire down near Galveston, and we got all of our equipment, and man, we were going to go and fight this well fire, and we got to a safe distance and stuff, and we were plotting out how we were going to do it. And then all of a sudden, the LaPorte Volunteer Fire Department came zipping by us right past the barricades all the way to the wellhead. Started dumping foam, dumping water, dumping all sorts of stuff on this fire. And they put the fire out. And Red was astonished. And they said, you know, you guys are brave. You know, there's going to be some people support the LaPorte Fire Department. One guy said, I've got $100,000 right now for that burned up rig. And they said, well, what are y'all going to do with this $100,000? And the chief of that LaPorte Volunteer Fire Department said, first thing we're going to do is fix the brakes on the next rig. So in a lot of ways, we're taking this moment, this spot in time, this day, to think about intentionally what we want to do. You know, Schreiner, I think, was caught a little by surprise by what it means to be intentionally Texan. We all assume that being intentionally Texan came with one particular set of instructions. We forget what a huge place we inhabit and what a remarkably diverse place we inhabit. Third most spoken language in Texas is Vietnamese, followed by Mandarin, followed by Tagalog. And as we go into the future, Texas is going to probably double its population by 2050. So think of everybody in the room and just put somebody you don't know right next to them, and that's what it looks like. And so how do we make the Texas story relevant for this next generation? How do we keep this Texas culture sustainable? Because people are moving to Texas for a reason. There's something about Texas that is attractive to people from California, to people from Florida, to people from New York, to people from Vietnam, the people from India, the people from Guatemala. We tend to think of Texas as it has been, but we need to stop and think about what Texas will be and what our role is in this process. And so when Schreiner said we're going to be uniquely and intentionally Texan, well, little did they know that they were making a declarative statement about the fastest growing state in the Union, which will be the most important state in the Union. So we're looking to compile an advisory board that'll help us turn the Texas Center into the most useful kind of place as we have these conversations about cultural sustainability going into the future. I congratulate Schreiner for coming up with the idea. I'm here because they recruited me to this task. So I have asked to gather today some of the great minds, the great thinkers that I've run across. I'm going to introduce them once here, and then they can reintroduce themselves when they speak. I've asked them to limit their remarks to 10 minutes. Then y'all can ask me anything you want at lunch. We're going to regather and have a panel discussion where we'll do Q&A in the afternoon. We are videotaping all of this. Videotaping, that's so 1980s. We're videoing this, capturing it digitally, because we all understand that the future belongs to the digitally savvy. And one of the things that we have hit on very early on in the life of the Texas Center is that we need to be digital storytellers. Ben Freeberg, who you will see kicking around all day today, he's in the back in the black. He is our content developer. And he is the guy that produces the digital stories that we're telling to the state. So let me introduce all of our speakers from top to bottom. Our leadoff batter today will be Josh Trevino. He has got an interesting job title that includes the phrase, the Texas identity in it, which is, that's fraught. And at the same time, absolutely exciting. He works for the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is a policy advisory group down in Austin that spends a lot of time at the Capitol. Sherri Driscoll, friend of mine for, a couple of decades, Sherri, wouldn't you say? She is now the Director of Education at the Alamo. Is that the title?
Education, Interpretation, and Curation.
Yeah, all that stuff. So, but she's been at the Alamo and seen the Alamo through thick and thin. And so the Alamo is the most visited historical site in the state. I thought it was important to have some words from the Alamo. Justice Ken Wise is not only someone that is involved in the texture of Texas, in this case the criminal justice system, but he's also a renowned podcaster. He has a podcast called Wise About Texas, which is highly acclaimed, and he is lots more famous for that than for all the other stuff he does on the bench. But he is a great voice and a great vision for Texas. Joe Herring Jr., I saw him over here. He is our local historian in residence at the Texas Center, and he is what I consider one of the best local historians in the state. I mean, the stuff that he does in his blogs and his books is just phenomenal, and how he is capturing the story of this region. And ultimately, all history is local, just like all politics is local. And I wanted him to speak a little bit about what it takes to culturally sustain even at the local level. We'll have a break after Joe, and then we'll have lunch. It's street tacos. You'll go out there, grab them, bring them back. Then I've got Lupita Barrera, who has spent her career again in public history. She was at the LBJ library for a while at the Institute of Texan Cultures. So she has done a lot of that sort of boots on the ground work as well in the public history sphere. Dr. Stephen Hardin is an academic and well known for essentially being the guy who defined the Texas Revolution for 2 generations. I mean, his story, his book, Texian Iliad, is how we know about the Texas Revolution. And it is painful to go anywhere with Steve, because all of a sudden you become invisible. And everybody wants to talk to Steve. I mean, there was actually an incident in Philadelphia where a cabbie turned to him and said, "You're Steve Harden." And I immediately vaporized, and Steve held forth for the next 45 minutes. With the meter running, I would add. But Steve and I have been colleagues for a very long time, as have Bruce Winters and I been friends for a long time. That's terrible grammar, but Bruce and I have known each other for a long time. Since 1985, when I was a cub reporter for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. And he introduced me to living history and public history. And he was also a long time at the Alamo, and he's now working with the Texas Rangers. He's working with the Bear Archives. He is what you would call a public intellect in a lot of ways. And he is the guy that I go to when I want to cast Texas in a larger global context. Ed Cottom has been my pal on the Texas Civil War trail for a very long time, written a number of books on Texas in the Civil War, but he's also been involved in philanthropy. He is affiliated with the Terry Foundation. He's a lawyer, so therefore he kind of has a lot of different angles on the Texas story as well. And then we will round out, before we break for lunch, I'll give you the Texas Center at its second birthday, although it's not till the 1st of June. And then we'll roll Ben Freeberg's first magnum opus. I guess you can have several magnum opus, anyhow. We're going to roll a video that we call our 2022 sizzle reel. We're capturing all this. Speakers, please stay up here in camera. Don't wander around. We're capturing your audio, so speak into the microphone so we can have a good product at the end of this for posterity. So the first one up is Josh, and then when Josh sits down, next one up, y'all just keep it rolling until we get to the break. Thank y'all.
Well, thank you all very much, and I really do want to, let me see if I can speak in here for projection purposes. I want to thank Schreiner for having the vision to establish the Texas Center, Dr. Frazier for leading it and for making it real. I did have prepared remarks, but they are resting comfortably in my room as part of my bid to demonstrate that I'm suited for academia, so you're going to hear me wing it. And you're going to find out the interior thoughts of a lifelong C student on Texas identity and heritage. So the voice of the people is about to speak. In all seriousness, Texas identity, one of the things that they say in Washington, D.C., when I was working there as a speechwriter many moons ago, was that you could tell how unimportant somebody was by how long their title is. And I have an exceptionally long title, but it is true that the second part of it is Director for Texas Identity. And Texas Identity happens to be something that is on my mind quite a bit. Just to give you a bit of personal insight as to why, I have the privilege to having been born a native Texan. And in Austin, that makes me a very small minority these days. But I was not raised here. We were an Air Force family, so I grew up in Korea, Washington, D.C., Florida, and Colorado, and wonderful places. But Texas was always the fixed point in our life and identity. And let me tell you, if you were in the D.C. public school systems in the late 1980s as a Cowboys fan, it was a rough passage. Nothing hones your sense of self like suffering in quite that way. Came back, as they say, as soon as we could. On my father's side, I think this is important to distinguish, not to talk about myself, but in terms of the lens through which we view things and the reason that these questions have been in my head for quite some time. My father is Mexican-American, and the Treviños, ended up coming to Texas for the first time, believe it or not, in the 1690s. Not a direct ancestor, but a collateral ancestor, came with the Spanish expedition to destroy La Salle's French fort. So I like to think we came for the right reasons. And we've been there since. Anybody who's familiar with South Texas, kind of the band from basically Monterey up through essentially the RGV is Trevino country. And then they expelled the lesser members like myself out of the region, and so we go forth and evangelize. On my mother's side, though clearly no surprise, I have Anglo ancestry. On my mother's side, she is an Anglo descendant of defeated Confederates who came to East Texas to make a new life for themselves after the war. But that is the extent of our family now that is native-born Texan. My wife is the perfect woman in every way except one. She's from Indiana. But she's a native non-Texan, and our two sons are both adopted from China, 8 and 6 years old, one from Ningbo, one from Shanghai, and they are being raised as Texans as well. And so the question arises, are my boys Texan? Is my wife Texan? What makes us Texan? I would submit it's not the accident of birth, much as we native Texans like to claim that. The reality is that those who made the positive choice to become Texans are as much Texan as the rest of us, whether they've been here for 5 days or the entirety of their lives. Now, outside of this room, I will continue to brag about being a native Texan, but that's the reality. And the truth is that we are always defined by those who made this choice. And the existence of this choice is what's so important about defining us. And I want to posit to you in the few minutes that we have here that Texas and Texas identity is defined by two things undergirded by a third. And those two things are the struggle and the idea. The struggle and the idea. T.R. Fehrenbach, really in whose shadow we all walk as students, whether professional or amateur, of Texas history, said, and I'll paraphrase this again because I lost my prepared remarks, that Texas has been defined by the endless struggle for the land. It's been defined by the endless struggle for the land. And that's true. Texas requires a great deal of struggle. We're very unique among the states. There's probably only about maybe 14 others, depending on how you count it, that can truly claim, among them are the 13 original colonies, that can truly claim to have been created through a deliberative process of war. War and revolution and the conscious, democratic, small d, democratic choice that was made by the people of the time to establish themselves as a nation. Very unique. And then, of course, independent of the course of our revolution, the winning of the frontier, the endless fights with whomever you wish, Indians, bandits, fights on the Mexican border, for example. Texas itself, stripping out the human element, is a hard land. Now, we'd love to claim and talk about how beautiful Texas is, but I think most of us can agree. There's a corner of East Texas that I think is an exception to this rule, but it is a tough country. It's a tough country. And listen, I've lived in the California Sierras. That's a nice place. Texas has nothing like it. And because Texas doesn't, because Texas is not a place of ease, it's not a verdant garden, with all apologies to Sam Houston, who called it the fairest land that he'd ever seen. That was a marketing slogan, I would submit, on his part. It is difficult to live in Texas. I just won a battle with fire ants in my yard, and a mere pittance of what pioneers or previous generations had to endure. Texas is hot. Texas is a place where you have to scrape out your living in various ways. Here in the Hill Country, it's easy to forget with the Californians and the Austinites driving up property prices here. If you don't believe me, go look. It's shocking. But this used to be one of the epicenters of poverty in the United States. Anyone who's read the first volume of Cairo's epic biography of LBJ, if you haven't, I urge you to go through about the first 100 pages, and he talks about how difficult it was to scrape out a living here in a region where the soil was so thin and the rock so near. So Texas is defined by the struggle, and that struggle continues, but the struggle is not enough. There are plenty of places where one struggles to live. Russia, another place I've been, is also a tough place to live, and they have not developed the toleration and spirit of democracy that Texas has. What's required to amend the struggle is the idea. The struggle plus the idea is what make Texas. And the idea of Texas, I would submit, can be found in our own Texas Declaration of Independence, a document which unfortunately is not as familiar to the mass of modern Texans as it ought to be these days. At the foundation, we have revived the practice of actually reading the Texas Declaration of Independence aloud every Texas Independence Day. You all are invited to join next year for the 189th. But in the Texas Declaration of Independence, there is the key passage. And it's this: the Texans are rebelling, again a paraphrase, so that they may enjoy the liberties to which they were accustomed in the land of their birth, the United States of America. That's the difference with Texas. That's the difference with Texas. Texas is defined by the struggle, and it is also defined by the idea. It is the struggle plus the idea of Americanism, of the American concept of a bounded liberty, with obligations, responsibilities, and rights all together, that makes Texas what it is. And that idea has animated us, imperfectly, I might add, through the entire 188 years of our history as a nation. And I do mean a nation in full, even within the United States. And so that idea plus that struggle is what defines us. And it gets back to answering the question, is my little boy, one born in Shanghai, one in Ningbo, are they as Texan as I am with roots stretching back 3 centuries? And the answer is unquestionably yes. Unquestionably yes. Because in Texas, we still must struggle in various ways to own the land, to have it, to possess it. And we also possess the idea. And those who subscribe to it are Texans, whether they're new or they're old. And that is that openness of Texas, that inclusiveness of Texas. The fact that Texas, as Dr. Frazier said, has Vietnamese as its 3rd most spoken language, Mandarin is its 4th, Spanish obviously is its 2nd, English is its 1st, is the glory of Texas, and it is the fulfillment. So I'll close with this because I know we have only 10 minutes. Every state in the nation used to be able to claim something similar, that there was the struggle plus the idea, and it's fallen away, unfortunately. We Texans love to claim, and I have claimed, that we're unique among the states. But the reality is that every other state in our country also has its own story of heroic struggle and striving to become who they are. And if they've forgotten it, because unfortunately most of them have, then what the Texans can do, and what Texas can do, and what the Texas Center can do, is serve as a reminder of their own struggle plus idea. We Texans are unique, and we'll never lose that. Our history is our own. But our example is an example for all Americans. We are the fullest fulfillment of what America is supposed to be. It is an inheritance that we have to guard. It is a pride that we take, and it is a mission that I'm gratified to see everybody in this room has accepted. So for Americans, for my kids, born into a dictatorship, thank you for defending Texas. And Don, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation, Don. Thank you for thinking of me. I take a circuitous route to the position that I hold today at the Alamo. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that happened. I'm originally from Oklahoma. Please don't hold that against me. I am consider myself a Texan. I graduated from the University of Central Oklahoma. I joined the United States Army out of college as a 2nd lieutenant. And I was stationed at Fort McClellan, Alabama, became a chemical officer. For those of you that don't know what a chemical officer's job is, I was responsible for the training of troops and teaching them how to protect themselves from chemical, biological, and nuclear warfare. That was put in practice when we deployed in support of Operation Desert Storm many, many years ago, and I was grateful for my training. I have to tell you that the Chemical Corps was not my first choice. I studied criminal justice. I wanted to be an MP, but the Army thought otherwise. As they always do, they know best. And so I continued down my path. I went to a place called Dugway Proving Ground, Utah. Has anybody ever heard of that? One person. That's surprising. It's a little patch of ground out in the middle of the desert of Utah. In the 1960s, the United States Army was testing biological agents. They had a little accident out there in the desert. There were tribes of individuals who herded cattle and sheep out in that desert. And one of the tanks on one of the airplanes that was disseminating a nerve agent, an actual live nerve agent, accidentally expelled it over a herd of sheep. Ladies and gentlemen, this place is known as the place where the U.S. Army killed 3,500 sheep in a matter of seconds. So that wasn't a great day for the Chemical Corps, and it was actually shut down for a number of years. Opened back up just in time for me to earn my commission and be branched as a chemical officer. I made the best of it. I certainly enjoyed my work. I met a gentleman by the name of John Driscoll, and I married him about a year after we met. We were both in Desert Storm. We didn't have any children at that time, thank goodness, but we did get to see each other once or twice while we were deployed. When we got back, we started a family, and I have 3 beautiful children who are all grown. My youngest is at the University of Texas now studying speech pathology. I took a different course after I raised my kids. I got my teaching certificate here in Texas, and I taught school at a couple of different locations, the last at St. Anthony Catholic School in San Antonio. I very much enjoyed my work, but I had started to volunteer at a place called the Alamo. I met Dr. Winders, and eventually he was kind enough to offer me a position. I worked in education, I worked with visitor services, and together I think we did a lot of great programming over the years. I did, however, a couple of years ago, get a little bit discouraged and wanted a little bit of a change. You know, what the Alamo is going through right now is a lot of master plan work, working towards the future. It's very exciting. It can be a little bit discouraging at times when things don't move as quickly as you'd like them to move. So I went to Texas State University and worked there in geography education for a couple of years. Just a few months ago, I got a call back from the Alamo, and they asked me to return, and so I'm back there now. I hope to be there until retirement. We are still going through that same process of trying to do the preservation work that needs to happen on the church and the Long Barrack. We also want to open an exhibit hall, hopefully by the end of this year, that will house the Phil Collins collection. And in a few more years, we're going to have a brand new education center, which is sorely needed on the grounds, to assist school groups, especially the general public as well, but especially those school groups that come every spring. We can have hundreds and hundreds of school children hopping off the bus at any moment, some of them with reservations and some of them with not, and a facility where we can serve them, where we can talk to them, where we can show them artifacts, things like that is what we really need. But that's only part of the process, because a few years more down the road, we're going to have a wonderful new visitor center in the buildings across the street. You may know them as the Crockett Building, the Palace, and the one on the end. Somebody tell me, I know you know. What is currently a Ripley's, yes. Those buildings will be emptied out by the end of this year, and the process will begin to create a visitor center. Big things going on, ladies and gentlemen, at the Alamo. I take my perspective on Texas history seriously as an educator, and now even more so as an administrator. We have a wonderful education program. We have a wonderful living history program, and a lot of that is due to Dr. Bruce Winders. These programs are what make a visit to the Alamo more than just walking through some historic structures. So my intent is to make sure that those types of programs grow and are increased over the next few years. You know, I started with small classes at St. Anthony. We have these huge groups that now show up at the Alamo, so it's certainly not exactly the same experience. It's a little bit easier to talk to a group of 20 to 30 fourth graders sitting in a classroom and keep their attention than 150 of them that get off 4 buses and they've never been on the site before, and they just want to shoot into the buildings and see what there is to see. But sometimes you have to pull back the reins just a little bit and remind them of where they're at. Sure, they've heard about the Battle of the Alamo in class by the time they reach us, hopefully, most of them. But when you walk onto Alamo Plaza, you all know as well as I do that the context doesn't just hit you in the face. The meaning of the place isn't the first thing you notice. There's crowds, big crowds, and a lot of nonsense going on around the plaza. That's being in the middle of a big metropolis like San Antonio. You have a little bit of everything going on while you're trying to grab the attention of a handful of school kids. But it happens. I see the difference in a child's attitude, his or her interest level, and the excitement is always there. A child's natural sense of curiosity is never more obvious than the moment that they arrive. Sharing the history of the Alamo is an awesome responsibility. You have to do more than show them some old buildings. And that's our goal. That they not only remember walking through the Shrine of Texas Liberty, the Long Barrack, seeing some artifacts on display in the exhibit hall, but they take a little piece of the Alamo along with them when they go back home. They share it with their parents, their siblings, their friends. Since my return to the Alamo, I've been a little bit concerned about the long-term effects of COVID on our operation. As you can imagine, during my absence and during COVID, the Alamo was closed at times. Our numbers dropped off drastically. In a good year at the Alamo before COVID, we would see 1.5 million people. The last couple of years, that dropped into the thousands. But it's come back. And nothing was more apparent than in the last 3 weeks or so of spring break. It's the Alamo that we remember, Dr. Winders. Thousands and thousands of people on the plaza, excited about catching a glimpse of this little piece of history. Several evenings ago, I was able to lead my first tour since I returned back to the Alamo. I'm a little rusty, I'm going to tell you the truth. Dr. Winters wasn't there to remind me of dates, so I had a little cheat sheet in my pocket. I didn't let my tour guides know that I needed that, but I pulled it out every now and then. I think I'm back on track. I'm good for a few more tours. We went into the shrine, we went to the Long Barrack, and into the exhibit hall. As it often happens, a young man asked me if there was damage from the battle, right at the very end of the tour. Gave him one last chance to ask any question they wanted to. So where's the battle damage? If this huge battle happened right here, in and around these buildings, why don't we see crumbled walls? Why don't we see cannonballs embedded in the wall? Well, I did the best I could. Dr. Winters probably would not approve of this, but I took them back out front, and I showed them a small depression on the facade of the church. It's only about that big around. It's about 3 inches in width, but if you take a 4-pound cannonball, it fits perfectly in that indentation. I told the group, this is the best I can do for you. The rest of it, you're going to have to take my word that it happened right here. It looked much different than it does today, but this is the place. I think to understand the place and the people, you have to look past the modern buildings and the city streets. Sometimes you need to look at a small section of limestone that's harvested more than 300 years ago to build a church on the banks of a beautiful little river. A river that sustained life in one form or another for thousands of years. Sometimes that's where you find the best that Texas has to offer, in terms of history at least. It might be in the middle of downtown San Antonio, or just off Highway 183 in Goliad, or just off the Houston Ship Channel, or in a grassy field near Mission Concepcion. You just have to look for it. It's there, like that small little cannonball depression on the facade of the Alamo Church. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning. I'm going to display the courage of the frontier by doing this without my reading glasses on, at least at the beginning. Great to see everybody. Thank you, Dr. Frazier, for inviting me. I'm honored to be here, especially to be with the distinguished other speakers who are the distinguished ones this morning. I like to brag that I signed up to support the Texas Center so early that Dr. Frazier didn't know what to do with my check. And I say brag because the mission of the Texas Center is exactly what Texas needs at this point in our history. Don called for a reintroduction, so I want to tell you a couple of things that I've done in my life, and I'm making a point that you will see in a minute. I am on the 14th Court of Appeals. I'm in my 19th year as a judge in this state. I was born and raised in Houston and had the good fortune to be able to run around on land near Montgomery, Texas, that my physician ancestor owned. He settled in Houston in 1836 and ended up settling in Montgomery because Houston was such a rough place. In fact, he appears in one of Dr. Hardin's books, and he too fled Houston in its early days. So I had a little bit of a rural upbringing. I also got to be, I went to Texas A&M and I was on the rodeo team, as all kids who grew up on the west side of Houston are, right? And then I got out of law school, thank goodness, and went to work for John Hill at Liddell Sapp, where I learned about politics. And I learned where the Capitol building, where the hallways of the Capitol led. And Governor Perry put me on the district court bench, and I began immediately working on legislation on behalf of the judges, which I've done every session since 2003. And Josh can attest that the bug bites you, and you learn a lot about people, forming those relationships in the legislature. Through all of that, Texas history has been a love of mine. And I was consuming Texas history from a very young age, as many of us have. But what I learned through those specific experiences that I mentioned, driving all over the state, pulling a horse trailer, walking around the Capitol with someone who had been Attorney General and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, trying to influence policy, what I learned was Texas history is directly relevant to Texas present. And it's useful. And I had never thought about that. I was not a history major. I realized that it's useful. And by knowing just a little bit about Texas history, I could be more effective in what I chose to do. And I'm here to tell you that by knowing a little bit about Texas history and understanding it, you can be more effective in what you choose to do. And that's an important life lesson that I've learned, which has made heroes to me out of guys like Don Frazier, Steve Hardin, Bruce Winders, and others. Texas history is important, it's useful, and it's critical to the future. Now, I was asked to comment on the people of Texas. I think that Texas has a lot of people, right? More arriving every day from strange foreign lands like California. I love this topic because after almost 20 years on the bench and running for election 6 times, I think I have met and know a little bit about Texans, and I've got a feel for it. Josh pointed out, and I've heard Dr. Frazier say the same thing, Texas is really a tough place to come make a go of it. If you were going to settle a place, Texas is probably not your first choice. Just think about the challenges just of the geography, as Josh mentioned, the rivers, the weather. We had the other day, last week, blizzards, floods, tornadoes, all in one day, all in our state. The sun, the temperature, coming here and making a go of it took a certain type of person. So think about what kind of person would leave the civilization of the United States or wherever they came from, Germany, England, everywhere, and come to a place like Texas. Well, it's somebody that's tough, obviously. It's somebody that loves and craves freedom. And it's also someone who's ingenious. Now, I went to A&M, so I had to look this up, but ingenious doesn't mean smart necessarily. It means clever. It means you figure out a way to get something done. Isn't that the story of Texas? You figure out a way to get something done and what needs to be done. It takes a brave person. It takes somebody with courage, not that you're not scared, but that you face it and you overcome it. That's who settled Texas. And when you repeat that millions of times over generations, when you repeat that person, you create a character and you create a spirit. And that's the spirit of Texas. And it's a spirit that resides in our people. And people of that spirit attract more people of that spirit. And that spirit is rewarded incredibly. If you have that character and that spirit and those traits, you are rewarded, and Texas will reward you and has rewarded all of us. Think about the things that this state has produced. Think about the things this state has invented. The integrated circuit, the Patillo Higgins thinking, you know what, I want to punch a hole in the ground down here because there's a little depression over here outside of Beaumont, change the world. The man on the moon, that mission was controlled from Texas, and now the private space industry, which are three words I never thought I'd utter in succession, is headquartered right here in Texas. Isn't that something? The Spirit built the state, and the Spirit is going to keep the state great. But you know what? That Spirit will atrophy if you don't tend it and don't cultivate it. We're in a very difficult time culturally in our country. It's a time where we need to protect the spirit of Texas. And we do that by taking it to the people where that spirit lies. We teach them what built this state, and by doing so, we show them how to keep this straight, us, not them, us, show ourselves how to keep this state great. And that's where a place like the Texas Center can be so valuable. History is the story of people. And when I talk about this spirit of Texas, and I talk about educating people on the spirit of Texas and preserving it, I'm really talking about Texas history. That's what I'm talking about. And we will face challenges in the next few years. We need to heal this country from the culture that we're in. It's poisonous, in my judgment. We need to actively shed any attempts to divide us. Texas is not immune from that, by the way. We're going to have to accommodate the era that we're in. We're in an era of growth. We've seen that many times before in Texas. We're in a growth period. We're going to need food, energy, housing, water. Those are all issues, and we're going to take care of that. We always have, and we will again. But to succeed in the efforts to do so, we will need to do what we're best at as Texans, and that's coming together to meet almost any challenge. That's what we're really good at. And the roadmap to that success lies in our history. Our history is that story. That's why I study it. That's why I write about it. That's why I talk about it. That's why I teach it at a similar-sized school to Schreiner in Houston. That's why I podcast it. The Texas Center will play a significant role in this process, and I'm honored to be a part of it. I sign off every one of my podcast episodes with the following phrase and a little bit of an admonition: go out and do something for Texas today. So I'm not saying you have to dedicate your professional career and pretty much all your spare time to Texas. I'm not asking you to do that, but I am asking you to ask yourself, what are you doing for Texas? What will you do for Texas? What are you willing to do for Texas? But I'll tell you, being here today, it's a pretty darn good start. Thank you very much for inviting me, Dr. Frazier, and I look forward to meeting everybody over the course of the day.
Good morning. As a native of Kerrville, I want to welcome you to Kerrville. It's good to have you here. It's good to have the Texas Center here. It's good to have the Fraziers here. And it's good to be here with you this morning. My name is Joe Herring. I'm Joe Herring Jr. I'm one of the many Joe Herrings. I'm the middle one. That means I'm not the smart one or the nice one. I'm the middle one. I want to thank Dr. Frazier for inviting me to speak. In very dim light, on a foggy day, I might be mistaken for a journalist. I'm not a historian, I'm a storyteller. And if Texas history is a mosaic, then I've been painting one small tile for almost 30 years. I'm focused on local history. I write about the history of Kerr County and the Texas Hill Country. I'm not unique. Almost every little Texas town has that one person who collects and preserves history. In Kerr County, I'm that person. Fortunately for me, this hobby is productive because a lot has happened here in Kerr County in the Texas Hill Country. Over the last 30 years, writing for our local newspaper, I've written about everything from dinosaur footprints to Clovis points being found here, to pictographs, to settlers from the 1840s, and stories about a woman who came here in 1905 with 3 little boys, and her husband was dying from tuberculosis. She decided to open a grocery store. Perhaps you've heard of it. It's H-E-B. A funny thing happens when you spend decades writing about your hometown. People bring you things. They bring you photographs. They bring you diaries. They bring you artifacts. So now I have a collection of items about the Texas Hill Country. My sweet wife, Carolyn, who I hope some of you will meet tonight at dinner, told me early on that I can collect as many things as I want, but I can't bring them home. She's a smart woman. Right now, they're at our company. I run a small family-owned print shop. It's a 9,000 square foot building, and about 7,000 square foot is taken up with artifacts from Kerr County. Along with Dr. Frazier, a group of us are starting a local history museum. We've actually got funding for its construction, and the work begins soon in the downtown area. I would say it's because I want to preserve history, but actually it's probably so I can get more room back in my print shop. This museum is designed to tell the story not of just Kerr County, but of the Texas Hill Country, of its special natural history, of the prehistoric people who lived here, of the settlers from the southern U.S. who came first, and then the immigrants, the Germans, the Poles, the Alsatians that made the Hill Country so unique. It'll tell the story of its heroes and its struggles. I especially appreciated the people who commented before me, because Texas is a hard place. And some would say the Hill Country is an especially flinty, hard place. And the people who make it here go out to change the world. What I've worked on is one tile in the mosaic of Texas history. And I think that's a good place to start. Thank you for inviting me.